Okay, so why don't we begin then? All right. If you'd like to say something, then unmute yourself and go ahead and say it. I have still not solved the two-screen issue. I'm on my way to resolving that issue, and then I'll be able to see all squares at the same time, but I can't toggle back and forth so easily. So all you need to do really is just to unmute yourself and say, excuse me, I want to say something. Okay, and that's for later. Okay then, so if somebody, Alan, would you like to read the first section from Judges, verse 1, 4 to 7?
You can hear me now, right?
Yes, go ahead.
When Judah advanced, the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. At Bezek, they encountered Adoni-Bezek, engaged him in battle, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and captured him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done. So God has requited me. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there.
You know, I used to say my experience with teens in Israel in the secular school system, which was I was a rabbi for people who did not consider themselves to be dati'im or religious, those that consider themselves to be secular, chilonim in Israel. I came to the conclusion that a lot of people, especially young adults as well, they stopped reading the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, after the beginning, after the first two chapters, because they said to themselves, this is ridiculous. We believe in evolution. We believe, I'm talking about Genesis now. We believe in evolution. We believe, this, what is this story about God is making Adam as if God's making Adam with God's own hands. And it's so sexist. It's maybe even misogynistic. And they just didn't read onward, because if the book is like this, why would I read? That's the important part of having a good start to any movie, to any TV show, to anything, right? If it's not it'll lose us if it's not good. And I feel the same way, in some ways at least, about the book of Judges. Many people began or have begun reading the book of Judges with this first chapter, and they say, give me a break. They're cutting off toes and thumbs. Is this the kind of book I really want to read? You know, the same way that we would react to a movie which is violent at the outset if that's not the kind of movie we want to see. It's violence, and not only that, there doesn't seem to be any resolution here of it being improper or unethical. The opposite is the fact. We'll get to that too. So that's kind of why I want to make this into an example, and why I brought much more interpretation than I usually would, so that we can talk about, how we're going to negotiate the book of Judges going forward for our lives, what we want to get out of it for ourselves as well. So before we go on, first of all, you tell me, everybody, what if this is the first time you're reading it, what are your reactions?
Pretty brutal.
Pretty brutal, right?
Shocking.
Also creative.
In what way creative?
Creative destruction. Without thumbs or toes, you're not dead unless you bleed to death. But you're not dead, but you can't do anything for yourself, and you're off balance. You're disabled,
right?
But still alive. It just seems pretty. Yeah. I just never heard of that. I'm just in the pantheon of horrible things to do to people. That's news to me. But I think about it, and it's, like I say, very creative.
Right. And in what ways does it disable someone, and what does it mean in the context of this story? Some of the commentators are going to bring that out for us. Good. Anything else? Anybody else?
Who were the Perizzites? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah. Okay. So good question. Before we get to the exact issue of Adoni Tzedek and his name that very understandably Alan stumbled on because it's so similar to something else. We'll talk about that in a second. Who are the two enemies here? The Canaanites we're used to seeing, and we had that before in our section last week. The Canaanites, sometimes it feels like they're relating to a particular nation, as it does here, and sometimes it's a catch-all phrase for all those that were in the promised land. And just another comment, again, be careful about muting yourselves, folks, okay? Or unmuting. It's interesting, in later Hebrew, in the last chapter of, I'm going to get to the Perizzites in a second, but still in the Canaanites, in the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, in the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, there is that poem, that famous poem, Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. And in it, there suddenly appears the word Kanani, Kapa Parsala Kanani. Her hand is outstretched to the Ani, that's the Ani. You know what, I don't have it in front of me, but the Canaanite is mentioned there. And obviously the commentator said, what does this have to do with anything? This is a poem about a righteous woman and how she runs her household, until it is proven in the commentaries there that the word Canaanite eventually becomes a phrase for merchants. The Canaanites were the quintessential merchants. So instead of saying merchants, you said Canaanites. And I can't think of an example here, but in our world today, but when a nationality becomes the catchphrase for some sort of a characteristic. And so it has been suggested here that while the Perizzites were a particular nation, we don't know anything about them. They're not mentioned in other sources. But the word Perizi means, the literal meaning of the word is that they're outside. They're not in the villages or in the cities. They're living in the countryside. And so what one of the commentators suggests here, and I think it's a good idea, is that the Canaanites were those dwelling in the cities. The Perizzites were those dwelling on the outwards. In other words, everybody. It's a type of merism that it includes two opposites that include everybody in between. But they come up from time to time. And when the seven nations of the Canaanites, the seven nations of the land that was promised by God to the people of Israel in the stories that the people of Israel tell, the Perizzites are one of them, Canaanites are one of them, there's five others, and we'll get to that in the context of one of the commentaries coming up. So that's the Perizzites. Now we have this character named Adoni Bezek. If we break down his name, Adon means Lord, and it means little L Lord, or in the case of Adonai, it means big L Lord. And hence Alan stumbling on it, which many people do. Adoni technically means my Lord of Bezek, but very often the yud at the end means it's part of an earlier form of the construct. In other words, the Lord of the place Bezek. And so many people would say, well, this is the guy, it's not his name, it's just he's the king of Bezek, so to speak, or the chieftain of Bezek. Bezek is a town. And although it's mentioned in other parts of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't really fit with where we are now as far as the land of Judah is concerned. So we don't know. The geography here is very, very foggy. It's fuzzy. It's fuzzy geography. And I don't know that it matters so much. The word Bezek it doesn't appear anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it's not in ancient Hebrew. It is in ancient Aramaic, and it means pebbles. So some people think that perhaps this was a derogatory term. Oh, he's the Lord of pebbles, so to speak, like the Lord of flies, right? The Lord of nothing. And then some people confuse him with a different king whose name is Adoni Tzedek. Adoni Bezek, Adoni Tzedek. And that's confused in a lot of different places, especially the rabbis. As I said last week, they don't like anybody anonymous. They're always trying to match people up. So we don't know anything about him other than what I've told you now. The argument against understanding his name as the Lord of the place Bezek is we don't have another example of well, except for Adoni Tzedek. But Adoni Tzedek and Adoni Bezek are the only examples we have of kings or chieftains being called by Adon plus the name of where they live. I don't know. Take it for what you will. So now we get to anything else before we get to the story itself or the punishment itself?
I do.
Go ahead.
The telegraph company in Israel is called Bezek. Is there a
Right.
reason for that? Is there a modern explanation for Bezek? I mean, is it like light thunder or something?
I think in medieval Hebrew, it becomes something of immediacy, but that's not biblical Hebrew. So how they got to that, it could be an influence of a different language.
Okay.
Right? Good. I don't think it's named after this guy, though.
No, I'm sure it's not named after this guy. No, I think that it may have meant speed.
Yeah, but not in biblical Hebrew. So how later Hebrew got that meaning, I don't know. They didn't get it from Aramaic. Was Aramaic maybe it did. I don't know. I didn't look into that, but something to look into. Okay. All right. So what do? They punish this guy by cutting off his thumbs and his toes. And Rhonda's correct in saying this is incapacitating him. It's turning him into, it's wounding him in such a way that he can't really do much, right? In particular, we'll find that he can't do much with his hands because he can't hold a sword, or with his feet because perhaps he can't run away or he can't charge or anything. But it's a mutilation as a punishment, which is it's either about torture or it's about debasement. But I was looking in particular for different layers of commentary, because if it was us, we'd have all sorts of it. We would be brimming with apologetic commentaries or ways to make sense of this. And interestingly enough, the main commentators are silent on this. Rashi, for instance, the main commentator of the Middle Ages in rabbinic commentaries, says nothing about this. The rabbis in the Talmud say nothing about this. It's as if it didn't matter or it didn't happen. It's not something that catches their attention. So I had to search a little bit more than I would, and that says something unto itself. That there's no obvious comments says something about it, that in the past this was not thought to be a problem. That's what it says, really. Okay, they're the enemy, and he's the enemy, and he shouldn't have gone up against us. He should have, whatever. Okay, so let's take a look. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's sparked one memory in me. In Leviticus, there's a place where the priest does a sacrifice and puts the blood on his thumb and big toe.
You're right, and it's the right thumb, right? Yeah, it's on the right thumb, the right big toe. And I did see a commentator that tried to connect the two of them. I don't buy it. It's hard for me to see that. That's good listening, but to me, it didn't take me anywhere. In other words, the point of that commentator was to say, just like that's a particular honor with them, this was a particular dishonor to him. But it didn't leave me any more enriched. But let's take a look. So Dan, I've got you on. What I did go to are other cases of mutilation that I know about in the Hebrew Bible. So if you could read the passage of Deuteronomy, you'll probably remember.
Starts reading.
Okay.
Before he starts reading, wasn't just the ancient world cruelty was just fairly commonplace. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the commentators didn't comment on this, because they would have just thought it was ordinary. Like we would think, I don't know, going to the grocery store is ordinary.
So here's the thing. Yes, you are right, except for we are always priding ourselves on the fact that we have been different, that we've been more ethical. So for instance, if impaling, tliyah, which was translated impaling was a punishment given in the Torah, and impaling means sticking it up to the backside, right? With a very sharp pole. That body, according to Deuteronomy, had to be taken down, not left overnight. In other words, it was tempered. Yeah, it's cruel, but we don't have, well, I'm about to say, we have lots of punishments for things that people do in the Torah. But let's take a look at this, and Richard will come back to that question afterwards. Also, in light of of the lack of material in ancient Near Eastern literature about cutting off toes and thumbs, or the only one instance that I did find. But go ahead, Dan, and read the passage from Deuteronomy.
If two men get into a fight with each other and the wife of one of them comes up to save her husband from his antagonist and puts out her hand and seizes him by his genitals, you shall cut off her hand and show no pity.
Now, most people that I've worked with over the years just don't know that verse. They never heard it. It's right there in Deuteronomy, right? And one of the reasons for that is because in the synagogue, where most Jews hear the Torah read or have read it in the Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, I can pretty much guarantee that there are less than 3% of the rabbis in the world who have chosen to talk about, no, maybe it's more, but no, this is not the topic of a sermon usually, right? And especially in that portion, there's so much other stuff going on. Why go to that problematic verse? So the verse is ignored. On the other hand, there are no other punishments of mutilation in the Torah. There are punishments of death for very severe things, but not mutilation, except for this particular one thing. And it's the exception that really, Shazad, that you could say proves the rule. The rule is that Israelite law was more progressive, in our eyes, more progressive than the law around it. I say that to you, Richard. And yet this one particular case stands out as a remnant from another world. I remember I actually did, you won't be surprised, those of you who know me, I have given sermons on this. In particular, I remember giving it in a year when there was an outcry over amputation, mutilation done in Saudi Arabia under Islamic law of thieves getting their hands cut off. And some story had come to mind that particular week. And I spoke about it. I said, let's just we don't do this anymore, but it's not like this comes from nowhere. And so I would say, and what I think most people would agree is this is a remnant from an earlier stage of law, which was more violent. And then you have to ask, well, of all the things that could have had sticking power, had staying power in the legal tradition, this is the only one that made it through the Israelite filtering. And the answer to that, of course, is yeah, because there's some things that men will just not tolerate from women, right? I'm mocking that, by the way, right? And yeah, when it comes to these kinds of things, misogynism is in the background, perhaps. Let me just take a break. I want to welcome. I understand not everybody could get on Zoom today, so some people are on Facebook live with us. I know Ron is. Perhaps there's others. And I know some people are here by phone as well, I think. In any case, welcome to everybody. We didn't do the go around this time. We did last time, even though there may be some new people this week. But we'll leave the feed open at the end if people want to talk and exchange a little bit more. Okay, so that's good. Yes.
An interesting dichotomy, at least to my mind, is that mutilation is both a punishment in this instance, but there are many who would think that circumcision is a form of mutilation of the male body, and that is to be accepted into the covenant of Judaism as a male within our. So it's both sides of the fence, sort of.
Right, and that is not that is a comment one finds a lot in Sweden. In Northern Europe, you find that kind of commentary. We found it in Santa Monica not too long ago, in San Francisco, where there was a move to municipally to forbid on the municipal level, make it illegal to do circumcision. That's not new, by the way. The ancient the Greco-Roman tradition also criticizes the Hebrew or the Jewish tradition for that reason. It's needless mutilation. I would say the difference is, Rob, is that your foreskin is cut off, and basically I think you can do everything that you could have done with it on, with it off. I don't know because I've only had it off. But Alan is shaking his head because he must know something I don't know. But I'm pretty sure you could do most things the same way. When you're missing a finger or a thumb, no, I'm seeing shaking heads. If somebody wants to disagree, please go ahead, but you're gonna have to do it with your voices. Okay, or are you shaking your heads because I said that? In any case, It shouldn't be the people that come on a regular basis, so you know that I say those kinds of things. All right. So, but yeah, there, you know, and in the same way, Rob, there's that argument over female genital mutilation, where in some, and by the way, it is such small groups in Islam. People sometimes think that that's what the Muslim tradition, that's not the Islamic tradition. In a very particular areas that happens, and that is deep-seated misogyny, I would say, or total lack of understanding, and yet they would say, well, that's the same as circumcision, right? But here, the mutilation is what's the word? I'm can't grasp the word right now. To prevent other people from doing it. What do you call that? As a
Deterrent.
deterrent. Thank you. Deterrent is that many people would say the mutilation thing is not just to humiliate, but it's a deterrent more than other punishments. It's a deterrent because, okay, one thing if you're put to death, but you want to live with this, it's, you know, through this humiliation, I guess. So a deterrent of sorts. So, all right, all that's in the background. But I brought this particular text to show that, yeah, we do have the cutting off. It's the same word in Hebrew, the katzatz, right? To cut off a limb. And here, you may say it's for a legitimate reason. I think most would say it is not, but especially since there's nothing comparable. If a man grabs the other guy by the balls, that doesn't happen to him. It only happens to the woman. Okay, let's go on to another verse. Rob, why don't you read B from 2 Samuel, another case of similar mutilation.
How much more then, when wicked men have killed a blameless man in bed in his own house? I will certainly avenge his blood on you, and I will rid the earth of you. David gave orders to the young men who killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung them up by the pool in Hebron.
So this is King David before he's king, right before he's king. And this has to do with a very complicated, intricate plot with Joab, I guess you say in English, Joab, his general, whose brother was killed by somebody, by Avner, and then they go out and he kills Avner, and then these other guys. There seems to be a culture of killing, of revenge killing going on, and David is trying to put a stop to this. He tried to put a stop to killing Avner, who killed his general's brother, and it didn't work. And then he had the person who was killed here is a young boy named Mephibosheth, who was was Jonathan's son, who was a cripple also, because when they were coming to kill him and his nursemaid ran away with him, she dropped him and then he couldn't walk after that. So here they take somebody who is is disabled and they kill him in his bed. And so David says, those killers need to die. Now, David is fighting against a culture of violence, of revenge killings in his own camp. This is right before he becomes the king. And so what does he have them do? Right? He removes cut off their hands and their feet. Now this is killing them and killing, in other words, mutilation of the body, again, to serve as a deterrent, I think. But it's symbolic, of course, that they're cutting off the feet and the hands that have to do with battle. They have to do with moving, doing things done, right? It's not cutting off the head. By the way, it was these boys, these young soldiers, that cut off the head of the kid, of Mephibosheth. Okay, and so where does...
Could you draw any kind of a line between this kind of revenge killing, and I think I saw a posting yesterday that the first female prisoner was executed. Death penalty execution actually took place yesterday. She was someone who murdered a woman and stole the baby. Is there a kind of a line between what we've just read and that kind of revenge killing? Because it was revenge killing to take this woman's life.
Yeah. I mean, that goes for death penalty in general. And you may know that, in fact, you probably saw it because I sent it out. I'm getting more involved in that particular issue. I'm now in correspondence with a Jewish inmate in Nevada who's on death row. And we're just beginning that correspondence. I'll try to keep people involved with what, if anything, we might be able to do. this particular case, yeah, and of course this is Trump's last days, and this is people in the Trump camp that really want to show who's in charge here by carrying out these. I don't know that it should be a difference between a woman and a man. Really, I know that we seem to react differently to the fact that it's the first woman. I don't know that that's really the right reaction. But so there's no question of the ethics of killing somebody else when they're the enemy or they've done something wrong in biblical times, or in rabbinic times for that matter. Although the rabbis of the Talmud made it very, very, very difficult to find somebody liable to the death penalty, right? Who would be given the death penalty. That is, even if they could do it themselves. I mean, that's entirely unsure from a historical point of view that they had that kind of jurisdiction. But yeah, we start from this and we go forward, and we do need to get to what we do today. What are punishments given for? And we know that in the climate in the United States of the last few decades, since the 80s at least, it's been punitive. It's all been about revenge, or it's been far more about revenge than it is about rehabilitation. And that was a good lesson that I got in Sweden when I was there, and I learned more about the penal system in Sweden, especially with a member of my congregation who was convicted of drug-related crime and was sentenced to, I think, 8 or 9 years. In the end, did more like 5 or 6. And already by his second, third year, he could study and to do a job outside of the prison. In other words, a totally different approach to justice, to criminal justice. So those are things that we want to keep in the back of our minds, and also to, from time to time, to raise and say, okay, what might we do about something like this? Okay. Thankfully, we don't have these kinds of punishments in our legal system. But I will tell you, I think we all know about these kinds of things that have gone on until very recently with U.S. armed forces probably around the world. And from time to time, whether it's posing with a cadaver or other things that you hear about that have perhaps been investigated, not just in Vietnam, but in recent wars as well. These are things that we need to raise up through the study of our texts. Okay. And then finally, Richard, what's happening in the ancient Near East at this time? I was only able to find this one parallel, this particular parallel that matched the toes and the thumbs. If you could read C, please, for us, Richard.
Okay. I fell upon tribesmen and killed 1,716 of their men. I defeated them from the well of Mercury, well, as far as the well of Galabu, and the well Suribu, and filled the wadis with their skulls. I removed the arms and lips of 80 of their men and released them to propagate my glory.
And that's where this is insightful for us. The whole point of him doing this, in other words, he filled the wadis, the canyons, with skulls, right? He's bragging, right? This king, whoever he might be, or this governor, right? He doesn't even have a name, by the way, in the text. It says the governor of this particular area of the middle Euphrates in Mesopotamia. And the point of him doing this to the 80, removing the arms and the lips, right, is to teach a lesson, right? This needs to be known in the countryside, that if you come up against me, this is what will happen to you. Arms and lips, arms because you do war with arms, lips because you talk, I guess. We don't have any comment. There's no Rashi on the documents of Suhu from the Middle Euphrates. Okay. Does anybody like to comment on this particular?
Yes.
Yes, Alan.
But these people that would have this done to them were going to die. If your arms are cut off and your lips are cut off, there's so much blood escaping your body from your arms, you're not going to live too long. So this is another way of getting around killing somebody.
Well, So there's reality and there's what he says here. So the reality may be what you say, although I could argue that they knew already then that if you take a burning branch of hot red embers and put it on the, what's that called? When you do that?
Cauterize.
Cauterize. I'm guessing they could do that then as well, right? Or maybe the lips is just to peel off a layer or to do something. So that's the reality side of it. But the literary side of it is that it's in order to send a message, right? I don't know what really happened. I don't know if this guy may have won the war against a few people that came out that were stealing his chickens, and this is what he wrote. I mean, but it means it has a life of a literary life. It's kind of like I've said to many people, people say, well, I don't believe in God. And I'll say that to me, that's a nonsensical statement. Or do you believe in God is a nonsensical question, because God exists whether we like it or not, at least in the literary form. You may not think of God as something, a superior being or in charge of the creator, but you can't deny the fact that God exists in literature and in people's mouths and in people's minds. So that's the balance here. What happened in reality or what's in the mind of the reader.
Very good.
Okay. All right. So Alan, why don't you read for us? So now we go from, actually you read already the top part. So we go now from the punishment to,
Rabbi,
yes,
Eric wants to talk, please.
I do have
sure.
a question though, because when you're talking about all this maiming and mutilation and just finishing, especially the whole Joshua, how Jews went in and they got the promised land under the direction of God, they were basically killing everything. I mean, children, women, men. So, this about mutilation, but God has directed such heinous things to happen that, to me, not a big surprise. But the other surprise is too, is when you're talking about murder and people being accused of murder, part of when they went into the promised land was these 3 specific cities set aside for murderers so that they were protected from someone else's family until they went to trial, which always amazes me. Why do you need 3 cities to take care of people who are accused of murder? Unless there was just a lot of that going around there all the time.
So just to put a sharper, it's not exactly murder, it's manslaughter that
Okay.
they're accused of, right? It's manslaughter, and in the case of manslaughter, there was the right of the family whose relative was killed to do a revenge kill, to do that kind of killing, and that's who they were saved from. But the out and out intentional murder, I don't think it covered them, right? They were put to death by the camp itself, all in theory, of course. So the bigger question, Eric, I think you're asking is that, when does taking a life, when is it legitimate? When's it not legitimate? And if it's one of us or if it's one of them, in the us and them world that Joshua and Judges were written in. There's us and there's them. Us, the people of Israel, have a covenant with God. We have special rights, and we've been given by God, that means the absolute truth, to do something. And part of that doing something is to fight. And if they go away, fine. If not, then we kill them. In some cases, we kill just the men. In other cases, depending on which nation it is and what lands it is, we kill everything, including the women and the children. Now, because they're not part of the covenant. Now, we have a hard time with that because we want to understand all of us, all of humanity created in God's image with free will and the ability to be part of the covenant. And this comes up, by the way, in the Torah portion that we're reading now as well, with God hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's also not fair. He has no chance to repent. Well, if you look at it in the way that I just described, he's not part of the covenant. And that's the way Jews and Christians and even Muslims have read these stories for centuries. In other words, the good guys and the bad guys, if you're with us, then you do it. And so then there's these borderline cases like manslaughter, right? But when it comes to murder and or the enemy in a war, that's considered to be perfectly legitimate, perfectly ethical. I don't know if that answers or addresses your statement so much, but we've got a few other things.
Did God dislike all the people in that land that he was giving to the Israelis? Did he have a hatred for them?
So, Yeah, the Israelites. So I don't think the word hatred would be right, because that would be assigning God. In other words, it's kind of like people that say, oh, you just don't like the president. We don't like the president. There's a reason. There's a whole background there. If you're asking, did God think that they were all immoral and therefore lost their right to the land? That's not stated explicitly, but it could be hinted at in the Bible itself. And it's certainly said specifically in rabbinic literature. They had their chance and they messed it up. In the same way that centuries later, the church fathers, or even the letter to the Hebrews, will say the same thing. They had their chance, the Jews, they messed it up. Now they're not important. You don't have to kill them, but they're not important anymore. And the Israelite faith is not important anymore. So yeah, but of course, where do we know this from, Bill? Anything we know about God comes from our own writers, our own authors. So we don't have, so if you're asking me what I think, I think that our ancestors created volumes of literature, a body of literature that would give them the justification for either doing, or the story of them doing, because it's not clear exactly how this happened historically, of taking over land that wasn't theirs. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a comment.
Yes, Ella.
We're talking here about, and we're appalled of them cutting off fingers and thumbs and so on. And if we just go back maybe 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and we look at the Holocaust, and I'm not even going to touch the death camps at this point. But before even the death camp started, where they went into the whole country of Lithuania, and they dug trenches, and they killed, except for 2 cities that went into the ghettos. They killed people, they dug trenches, they lined up old people, young people, men, women, children, and they just killed them. And nobody mentions this. I mean, I noticed that you have an article later about Rabin, that he broke fingers, and that he broke, he broke bones. Supposedly he said he broke, and you don't have anything mentioned about the atrocities that were committed by the Germans.
Ella, first of all, let's talk about Rabin when we get to it. But in general, I will answer you, we're studying the book of Judges. We're not studying what happened, in general, we're not studying what happened in the world around us. And what we're trying to do is to make sense of a text that we consider to be sacred, and how do we deal with it today? This is not about taking stock of the human race, who's right and who's wrong. That's not what this is about. This is about us checking ourselves and our relationship. And if are we comfortable, where's the test? The test would be, are we comfortable reading this story to our grandchildren, to our children, to our grandchildren, as little kids, in the same ways that we read the stories about Jacob meeting Rachel at the well? And my guess is we're not comfortable with it. And where there are nations that are comfortable with it, but I'm not teaching them. We're not studying together. This is not about a scorecard, Ella, who's right and who's wrong in the world. So therefore, any criticism of Israel, modern day Israel or ancient Israel, is legitimate, because we're Israelites in that way. We're talking about ourselves and who we want to be and what we want, and how do we deal with difficult texts. Okay. Sid, but let's try to keep the comments short so we can move ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say, I remember back when I was in the yeshiva, somebody said that when a Sanhedrin killed somebody, it was from then on, it was considered a murderous Sanhedrin. That's all I remember.
Right. So you are right. That's kind of in the framework of what I spoke about before. The rabbis of the Talmud made it very difficult to find somebody guilty and punished by death. And it is said in the Talmud that a Sanhedrin that killed more than once, 50 years or 70 years, was considered to be a bloody Sanhedrin. So yes, there is. Okay, let's go on to the second part of that story is, so what is the book of Judges trying to tell us? The story doesn't end with that. It could have ended with that, right? But then it goes on to say, Adoni Tzedek himself says, well, he's almost saying, this is nothing. With my enemies, I did this, and Ella, this is kind of for you as well here. It's the other side. When I did this, I did it to how many more? To what does he say? To 70 kings, right? You're doing it to one. That's nothing. As his thumbs are bleeding, right? That's nothing. I did this to 70, right? And they had to scrounge for scraps under my table like dogs. And then comes the main point of why we're hearing this story. He says, I guess this is God giving me my punishment. And that's kind of an amazing thing. It's one of those precious stories in the Hebrew Bible where the other, the ultimate other, whether it's Jethro or whether it's Nebuchadnezzar, whoever it might be, even Pharaoh, comes to the conclusion, I guess your God is the God. And I guess you guys are on the right track. That's how we write the story about the enemy. And he came, it's like whatever terrorist, the anti-Israeli terrorist, whoever it might be, at the end of his days, he comes to the conclusion, you know what, I was wrong, they were right. And that's what people like to hear in a story, right? And so in thinking of this scrambling for scraps under the table and comparing somebody to a dog, I was reminded of this passage that we saw when we were studying Matthew. If I could ask Rob, do you want to read the passage from Matthew, please, D?
He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
I'm sorry, I should have set it up. The set is a woman who wants to be cured, a non-Israelite woman who wants to be cured, and he says, I only do with Jews here, non-Jewish woman. I can't help you.
Let's see. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. He answered, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. She said, yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table.
So this idea of using this imagery of dogs, but really talking about people as well, right? Something just this doesn't help us understand our passage so much, but this idea, just by the way, I know that I've said many times I'm going to do a session on dogs and on pets, mostly dogs. For in biblical times, dogs were not pets. They were there. They were either kicked around, or perhaps they were used in shepherd in tending the sheep. But they're not pets in the same way. And on the other hand, we think of, some people, I've been in people's homes where don't worry, the dog will pick it. If something falls under the table, the dog will clean up the floor. But this idea of the people at the lowest rung of society, they're compared to dogs. Okay. Let's see. Rita Claire, would you like to read from what Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershom? I said there wasn't a lot of commentary, rabbinic commentary in this passage. We haven't seen anything until now. The first one I found is in the 12th century, end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century.
Okay, is that E?
Yes.
They cut off his thumbs and his big toes in order to instill fear upon the rest of the kings, and that they may fear going up against the Israelites in war. And it was providence punishing measure for measure, as he himself said, as I have done.
So two parts of this. One is it's to a deterrent for the other kings. This is what will happen with, not only will we kill you, but we will humiliate you, and you'll walk around like a warrior. I'm thinking of Lieutenant Worf in Star Trek, right? You have to live. They've got to live. They've got to die a noble death, a courageous death, and not, God forbid, be humiliated in this way. And then the other thing is it's provident. This was inspired by God, and it was measure for measure. In Hebrew, measure for measure is midah keneged midah. Measure for measure is expanded a lot in the early Midrash in the time, say the 2nd, 3rd century. And there's a huge section about Samson. So when they want to use it, the measure for measure, using biblical characters, they do it all the time, right? And there's, Jacob, there's a lot of different examples. But interesting enough, it's not found in rabbinic literature that this is a good example of measure for measure. Okay. And then a little bit later, come on, two centuries later, we have Abarbanel, again, one of the prominent commentators to all of the Tanakh, all of the Hebrew Bible, but really studied in this section of Nevi'im Tuvim, the latter part And it's not an easy commentary to use. He's very long-winded. So until you kind of digest, boil it down to what he wants to say. So Rhonda, would you read F, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel?
And the king, weak of heart, fled, but they pursued him and captured him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. My understanding of this is that since he was a king, he should not have tried to flee the battlefield, as it would have behooved him to die there and not live out his remaining days in disgrace at the loss of his kingdom and all that was his. And it was because he fled and did not fight that they cut off his hands. For instead of using them heroically, he chose not to fight. And his feet, since he fled. Also, this was providence in order to repay him for what he had done to the other kings.
So he likes the providence idea from Ralbag. I don't know if Abarbanel saw Ralbag's commentary or not, but he brings it into almost something that would be as if he's in Adonai Tzedek's culture, talking about, well, they say he deserved it because he didn't do what he was supposed to do, right? And it should be feet, as you correctly read there, not feet. Why I wrote sick in both cases because he actually says hands and feet as opposed to thumbs and toes. But we get the idea here, right? The why dafka, why especially the hands and the feet, or the thumbs and the toes, because he should be holding a sword with his hands and he should be running into battle with his feet. And then finally, we jump to the late 19th century. There's a really interesting commentator, Hasidic commentator, that is published, widely published, so people know a lot about him. And it's an interesting commentary because he's totally harmonistic. He manages to find a way for everything to make sense with everything else. In fact, it's the only 100 I got on a paper when I was at Hebrew University in my first year. We had to compare two passages, one from Chronicles and one from the Book of Kings, according to biblical, that's one of the bases for modern biblical criticism, that that each author has their own way of describing something. And so I did exactly the way Wellhausen, the German Bible scholar of the 19th century, wrote his article. I kind of summed that up. I said, and yet there's another way to see this. Another way to see this, and then I brought the Malbim's commentary, in which he very intricately, in a very, very complicated matter, shows how both of the texts can be accurate, because, well, this is talking about this case, it's talking about this case, and so it's very convoluted. It's a long commentary to use, but from time to time I like to look at it to see, especially if I haven't found much in previous commentaries, and this is what I found there. If Sue Ordner, would you read G, please?
And they cut off. God inspired them to do that which they did to no other enemy. And while it's not really according to Jewish law, since killing those of the 7 nations, Canaanites, Girgashites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Evites, Amorites, and Hittites, is to be done by the sword, and not to torture them in this way. Here they punished him measure for measure.
So what he's doing is he's saying that, and that's why I think this is an important commentary. 19th century, Jews are being kicked around in his world, right? Nobody is enjoying being a Jew, certainly not a Hasidic Jew in that world. And yet he says, well, actually what they did was not according to that. They shouldn't have done that. That's not the law is you kill them and not torture them in this way. And to me, that's an interesting comment to bring up here. It's a self-critical, self-criticism. And he says, but this was a special case because he had done it to others, so he needed to get that measure to measure. Now I'm reading into it, but perhaps he needed that for his soul as a non-Jewish soul to go where it needed to go. He needed that kapara, that atonement, so to speak. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but still, it's really interesting. And here you have the delineation, by the way, of the 7. You often find the 7 nations. That's the catchphrase that you find in rabbinic literature for anything having to do with the Canaanites. Okay. And then finally, I'll let you read this on your own. And I don't say this is the same thing, but this is what came to mind when I'm thinking. I'm guessing there were cases, I don't know. I'm guessing there were cases of this kind of behavior over the last 70 years by the pre-statehood military bodies of Haganah and Lehi and Irgun. I'm guessing it happened. I don't have any evidence, and I don't have those kind of books at home to check to see of the people that began to write Israeli history, modern Israeli history, with a new way, which happened in the last few decades, to look at these things. Although we do know of certain cases where there was slaughter and there was denial for decades in the state of Israel. We don't do that. That's what they do. We don't do that. So in answer to you, Ella, very often that's what you hear. Our army, the Israel Defense Forces, is even called Defense Forces, right? We are at a step above the others. That's what I was taught as a soldier in the IDF. That's what I believe by and large. By and large, I do think that we have a high level, or when I was in there, we had a high level of morality and ethics. And yet from time to time, things come up. This is not me bringing this piece from the New York Times. It's just happened to be something I could easily put here. That was talked about a lot. Did Rabin say, and it came up just a few weeks ago, right? In November, when, who was it? One of the squad, what are they called? Who said originally she would speak at a memorial for Yitzhak Rabin. Then she went back and said she wouldn't. Was it AOC? I don't know. I forgot exactly who it was. And it's because of this, because Rabin had been accused of saying this to, when he's defense minister, to his general, to bring down the troops. You've got to, break their bones. This was during the Intifada. This was a very difficult time in Israeli history, right? Not so distant history. There was a lot. There were bombs. There were all sorts of things going off, and so there needed to be a deterrent. And now he may not have said this at all. He denies, his widow in her biography absolutely denied him ever saying this. But this was talked about a lot because it was possible. People that were, I had commanders that sometimes talk like this as well. In one of my last stints in reserve duty in Hebron, where my brigade commander was somebody who went on to be a member of the Knesset from the parties that I don't vote for, was extremely hostile and extremely, I would say, violent in his talking to us as a group of a few hundred soldiers before we went out to where we were deployed in Hebron during the Intifada. And so this is possible. And I bring this up not to say, Ella, that the others don't do it, but I'm not talking about the others. That's not my topic. My topic is us and how do we relate to it. And I would like to learn from this story what not to do when we're in the state of war with another nation, even if we have to kill the enemy. Ella, go ahead.
I think, I don't know, in a way, I just think that Rabin was taken too seriously here, that he may have said to a group of people, let's get up and break their bones, not really meaning that exactly what, in other words, to punish them, but not, not to kill them.
Yeah, again, I don't know what Rabin said. I wasn't there, and that could very well be the case. And it could be that somebody else projected what they were thinking on Rabin. That's possible, but those kinds of things were said at that time. And that I can attest to myself. Thankfully, I will say that I never had to do those kinds of things, but I felt sullied enough myself, I'm just speaking for myself, that when I was in my final years of reserve duty and in Hebron, so this is in the early 90s, first half of the 90s, I can remember having to go into people's homes at 2, 3 at night, in the middle of the night, and get them all against the wall and to show their papers and to go through stuff and things. And I felt horrible about it. And I didn't have to do things that some of my friends had to do, which is shooting into crowds or shooting at people, whether it was rubber bullets or whatever. Again, I'm not condemning the situation. I'm not saying that the rioters or the terrorists are better. In fact, I'll say they're worse. But for me, that's not who I'm worried about. I'm worried about our own soul. Anybody else before we go back to Ella?
Another little question. What period in history does it approximately take place?
Again, what's the question?
What period in history does this take place? Because I read one and apparently they captured Jerusalem. So under whose hands was Jerusalem at this time?
Jerusalem was a Jebusite city, and we'll get to that. And that's the final part of why we're not. Again, I apologize for doing this just on 3 or 4 verses, but I wanted to make example out of this. But they've not yet conquered Jerusalem, right? So in the end, they bring him to Jerusalem, and that's where he dies. They don't kill him. By the way, Josephus adds at that point that, and they gave him a proper royal burial. Right, which is not in the text, but Josephus thought that was important.
So this is way before David.
Yeah, not way before, but it's in the middle of the 2nd millennium. Okay, we don't know, but let's say 1300 BCE.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments about the difficult stuff we spoke of?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to point out this happens in the United States as well. I mean, we hold ourselves to be above, and yet there's countless examples of from My Lai to the situation and was in Iraq where the children, young people were killed, murdered. So it happens.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just take a look at the final section. Richard, why don't you read that final section for us? 8 to 11.
Okay. The Judites attacked Jerusalem and captured it. They put to the sword and set the city on fire. After that, the Judites went down to attack the Canaanites who inhabited the hill country, the Negeb, and the Sephalah. The Judites marched against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron, and they defeated Shisha, Iman, and Talmi. The name of Hebron was formerly Kireth Arba. From here they marched against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sephar.
All right, so this is an example. We're going to go quickly through these kinds of verses. There's a lot about geography, which I don't find entirely interesting, and it clashes with other lists, geographical lists in Joshua or in other places. But just to mention here, these 2 places, Hebron and Kiryat Arba. Hebron, which was formerly known as Kiryat Arba, that is the city of the 4. The 4 were these giants. And we have this tradition of giants here about Og and Sihon, the 2 kings of the Amorites, the Bashan and the Amorites. There's this prehistorical memory of these giants that threaten, and that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Why are giants in the background? Have they ever found bones of actual giants? But in all ancient kind of lore, there seemed to be a lot about giants, and we have our own share. And finally, David Friedman, if you could read from Josephus his paraphrase of this section.
Sorry about that on my iPad. So I had to go to unmute. They removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men. Now they gave this city to the Levites as an extraordinary reward with the suburbs of 2,000 cities.
Okay, so to this very day, we somewhere in the places that Josephus visited 2,000 years ago, there are the bones of these giants. Okay, and so we'll pick up the pace quite a bit next week. Are there any final questions or comments? Yes, John, please.
This is not based on the scripture we're reading, those stories, but when I started reading the Old Testament many years ago, and then every year would go through the entire, from the Christian point of view, the Old and New Testaments, I was mentally, morally challenged by lots of verses in both sections. And one of the things that helped me get through some of it mentally is we need to remember that some of the punishments in the Bible, I'm talking about some of those encoded through Leviticus and stuff. Instead of looking at them, well, gee, that seems harsh, it kept a more severe punishment from happening. If my neighbor put out my eye, my family was not able to kill them as the revenge because that they weren't tantamount to each other. That changed my thinking. It helped me get back to the place in history that some of these things happen. It wasn't today.
Right.
I actually saw mercy sometimes in these punishments that are actually embedded in scripture.
Right. So an eye for an eye is a good example, John. In the Code of Hammurabi, some of those cases that if a slave put out the eye of a free man, then that slave's life would be taken. So given in that context, as you say, an eye for an eye is actually progressive. But soon after, the rabbis of the Talmud never understood it to be an actual eye for an eye, but the value of an eye for an eye. So there's a constant progress being made, I think, and we like to see things that way. One of my points of us studying this is that we want to make sure that that progression continues, but sometimes there's setbacks. And that's why I brought the passage from Rabin without that being a particular parallel, but something in the same area of what we're talking about. I want to make sure that everybody understands. I'm not talking to our group now, but I'm talking to some of my fellow Israelis and some of my fellow Americans who have a different belief of what should happen in the state of Israel today vis-a-vis Palestinians. I want them to understand that that was then and now is now, and there's been 3,200 years of commentary that we should take into consideration and continue on that line as well. And this is in a way, as I'm sure you imagine, John, this is an answer to a fundamentalist reading of these texts. Anybody else? Well, Deborah and Diane, we don't know you yet, but it's good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Pansy, I understand you're doing better now. We're happy to hear that. And you'll be able to leave your home soon. Who else do we have that I haven't seen before? Everybody else, I think we know. Teresa, it's good to see you from the upper desert, and Dan from the upper desert. And if everybody is all right, then is everybody all right? Does anybody need anything?
No.
Okay, then. Well, I'll see everybody next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Alan, I
Thanks
sent
so
you a
much,
text
Rabbi.
last week, didn't hear back from you. Just checking to see if you're okay. Check your phone, see if it came through.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Yep.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
Oh,